It has been said that we are three people: the person we think we are, the person others think we are, and the person we really are. But how do we get closer to answering the third of those, the one of who we really are? Phrasing this as a question to ourselves might get us closer to discovering the strands of what we call our identity. And learning to phrase this as a question to others helps us all get closer to theirs. My aim here isn't to instruct or to teach, but rather to leave you with a seed that, if cultivated, might offer you a different perspective on yourself and those around you. Even as I posit this title, you're likely curious what I can mean by my identity. Based on my appearance alone, or having taken this stage, you're maybe also curious how I identify, or what experiences in my life have brought me to this stage. Or you may even be curious how you would approach a conversation about something so personal. But at any rate, I invite you to hold on to this curiosity, for this is the seed that we need to cultivate, because we too often let it go too early. Now, as we continue this discussion of identity, we must first ask, what is identity? And a simple answer might understate the depth of the concept, but simply put, identity can be the answers to the questions: who are you? What is important to you? And what distinguishes you from someone else? And our answers to these questions often draw from our hobbies or our interests, our race or our culture, our religion, our gender, our political viewpoints, or perhaps the type of music we listen to, our sense of fashion, the friends or company we keep, or a multitude of things entirely outside of these. The process of uncovering and discovering identity is often described as a journey, and one that is depicted as deep, personal, and at times political. And on this journey, as we mature, we nurture and develop the decisions that we feel are most congruent with our true selves, or at times negotiate why our behavior may not quite line up in that way. It is an iterative process, one we attempt implicitly far more than explicitly, and one that is often endured alone. So in my own experience of developing and sharing identity, I'd like to contribute to this conversation by sharing with you a few perspectives I've gathered along the way. And the first of these we've already started to discuss. As a construct, identity is hard to define, aside from what makes you, you. However, as we learn the language and behavior that we feel best describes ourselves, we often turn to words or labels to communicate our identity. And although it is difficult to define, that is something we get to do. Sometimes we are handed pieces of identity to try on, and this is fairly common in childhood. Yet at the end of the day, it is up to us whether or not to accept these as our own. And as much as it is ours to define, it does not define us. We are free to, and often do, act outside of our identity, and that's okay. Our identities are unique to us. As we explore, develop, and claim various labels that we feel best describe ourselves, we must recognize that each one of us that claims one of these labels doesn't experience the meaning behind it in the same way as someone else. This makes it important to share not only the labels that we use, but the meaning behind them as well. And identity isn't always obvious. Internally, as we filter and sift through various facets of identity, we might find that many of them don't fit very neatly or intuitively, and we may need to trim or alter them to find what fits or feels most authentic. And at some points along the way, we may feel that we do not have the resources or understanding to be able to do this on our own. And externally, there may be a disconnect between how we identify and how we are perceived. What we do or like, or how we look, may not always correlate with how we identify. This makes it important to discuss, to not assume. Identity isn't static, and as such isn't something we solve once. Surely some parts of ourselves will remain constant over time. Yet, over that time, we might find that our labels or the meaning behind them evolves, or we might find entirely new ways of describing ourselves. And when we're describing ourselves, we don't often use just one word, and as such, aren't composed of only one identity. We hold many, and all of them simultaneously. And these identities, they have a lot of intersections. And this relates to the way that the various facets of our identities interact with one another, and the way that each of those interacts with the various pieces of someone else's identity. If we think more deeply about the many ways in which we interact with others, we'll see that we don't often put all of our identities forward in a single interaction. This is especially true for the way many of us separate our vocational and personal identities. However, the connections we make might be made more authentic if we can learn to share more of ourselves with the connections that we make. And our identities influence the way we see things. We tend to generate conversation using perceived notions of identity, and we're more likely to reach out to someone when we feel that we might share a similar aspect of one. However, this can leave us less likely to engage with those who have viewpoints or identities outside of our own. And when we try to interpret other people's words or views from how we see them, we are more likely to disagree rather than listen. And from these perspectives, it is clear that identity can be complex, but ultimately, identity is important. We could even view identity as a reflection of what someone holds most important. But we must recognize that our identity holds its most meaning to ourselves. Sometimes we get caught in not taking the stance that other people's identities are also important, and we must understand what it means to them. Now, all of these conversations were grown out of conversations. And one's not specifically about identity. So what do we do with them? How might these perspectives inform how we develop and share what is important to us? One important step can be to acknowledge that the labels and behavior we use to convey our identity only get us so far. On one hand, the words we use to claim identity really only show how we classify ourselves and not what it means or feels like to us. What if we shared the responsibility of having to uncover ourselves and sought to offer ourselves with more depth? And on the other hand, we often interpret the words other people use to describe their identity through the lens of what those words mean to us. What if we took the opportunity to see others from their perspective and sought to understand their meaning behind their words? So let curiosity be your motive. Cultivate this seed. Instead of asking facts about someone, try to learn what is important to them. We tend to lead conversation with questions like, where are you from? Or what do you do? In order to understand how someone exists in relation to ourselves. But don't stop there. Break that cycle and progress forward with, what is that like? Or what does that mean to you? Ask them to describe their thoughts and feelings and the meaning behind their words. As someone shares their story, consider what parts of themselves they are trying to convey with each of their words. Clarify what their words mean to them, and consider offering what they mean to you in order to build mutual understanding, or perhaps have a conversation about how you came to view something in a similar or different way. Ask why more than what, and this doesn't have to be in a literal sense. As someone offers something important to them, consider inquiring if they would consider that a piece of their identity. And if so, when did they begin to classify themselves that way? Which parts have felt more salient recently and which have felt the most stable across time? And if you find yourself struggling with how to approach or phrase a question, consider just labeling your curiosity. Try the phrase, I'm curious about, and after you label it, invite them to have a conversation about it. And you might find that these conversations work both ways. Developing identity in isolation only gets us so far in understanding ourselves. As we share parts of ourselves through our experiences, our conversations, or through art or social media, allow others to join in those conversations as we develop ourselves. Field their curiosity with humility, as much as you bring yours to the table. And these things don't just apply to new relationships or connections. Familiarity crowds out curiosity. Sustain your relationships by staying curious. Remember, identity isn't static. Yours is always developing, so keep developing it. And the same is true for others, so keep asking. Now, an appropriate disclaimer. Introspection and vulnerability are places that many people feel uncomfortable in. So we need to be mindful of when someone isn't ready to step into our circle and respect a reluctance to talk about it. But perhaps one way to create that magic circle with someone is to draw those lines, step in first, and then invite them in. Now, this might require us to lead with vulnerability and is sure to catch some off guard, but I assure you this has so much more to do with the experiences that have brought them to you than the one that you have brought before them. Allow them to feel that your curiosity only harbors the intent to connect, and that their curiosity is welcome in your circle as well. Now, these thoughts don't stop here, but taken together, they beg the larger question, what if we shifted our mindset about identity to view it as something meant to be developed and shared together? We are all responsible for and play a role in shaping the identity of everyone around us. As we strive to offer more of ourselves by sharing our identities with the connections we make, we might find that everything we touch is able to receive us a little bit more authentically. And as we strive to understand others more deeply by seeking their identities, we might find that we are better able to embrace them with empathy. And empathy not in terms of walking in someone else's shoes or seeing through their eyes, but instead closing your own and lending an ear as they describe what they see, how they see themselves, and what is important to them. Relationships built around developing and sharing identity might be more intimate, vulnerable, and compassionate, with a depth centered around feeling more seen, heard, and understood. These relationships foster growth on all sides as we expand our views to include other ways of thinking and meaning, and leave us with a greater tolerance for viewpoints other than our own, for we can understand even if we disagree. So I leave you today again with the title of this presentation on a slide, and still the question of what it might mean to me or to someone else, in hopes that your seed of curiosity will lead you to ask me or anyone else what it means to us. So stay curious, listen with the intent to understand, and speak with the desire to be understood. No part of identity is truth, but talking to others about their identity brings us closer to understanding their truth, and perhaps uncovering our own. Thank you.